Yes, the S-ICD has been approved for several years, both in the United States as well as in Europe, and it's primarily been used in most instances as an alternative to a typical transvenous ICD. So the populations have been studied have been largely niche populations of younger patients with less heart disease, in whom it was thought that a transvenous ICD was not appropriate. Once it was approved in the United States, there was a mandated post-market approval study, and our goal was to have a much broader representation of patients and centers, so it wasn't the usual high experienced centers who were passionate about the device, but broad representation both for indications as well as for expertise in implanting the device. So it was a prospective registry, so it's not randomized. It was by far the largest study ever of this device, so over 1,600 patients, and there were 86 centers, which was important. So rather, again, than having just a small number of centers who know the device very well, it was broad representation throughout the United States. And the indications was anyone who needed an ICD could be enrolled in the study. Yeah, so what we found is this was only the early results within the first 30 days after implantation. So what we found was at first the population was much more typical of an ICD population than of subcutaneous ICD populations in the past. So the ejection fractions were lower, many more comorbidities. More than half the patients had heart failure, a lot of diabetes and hypertension, underlying coronary artery disease. So we're very excited that we got a broad representation. And in fact, the survey of the physicians showed that more than half of them, of the patients, were eligible for a transvenous ICD. So they made a choice rather than they felt that that was their only option. And what we found was that the success for terminating ventricular fibrillation was almost 99%. So it was very successful, similar to what was seen with healthier patients, but now with a much sicker group of patients. The device worked very, very well, and a relatively low complication rate of about 3.6% over 30 days, which is similar to the type of complications that we see with transvenous devices. So we're very excited to see that it performed in a very large, unselected population of centers and largely patients with very, very good outcomes. Well, I think it tells us that there are still some groups that it's a preferred device. So in this study, there were an increased number of patients who were on dialysis, increased number of patients who had previous infections from transvenous ICDs. So those indications are still there, but it can be used comfortably more broadly in patients in whom, for whatever reason, you feel that a device that doesn't have leads in the bloodstream and in the heart would be advantageous, with the caveat that this subcutaneous ICD doesn't have pacing capabilities, so that if patients need underlying pacing or for bradycardia or antitachycardia pacing or cardiac resynchronization therapy, it's not a good choice. Well, we're excited because this is a planned 5-year study, so we'll get long-term data in terms of the performance of the device, the arrhythmias that get treated in ambulatory patients, not just in the lab. So this is just the beginning of the data we'll get from this study. But there are now a number of ongoing studies, including the Untouched study, in which we're looking at only patients with a low ejection fraction in primary prevention, the largest group that get transvenous ICDs, to see how well they perform. And there's a study, Praetorian, which is a European-based study out of the Netherlands, which is actually a randomized study of transvenous versus subcutaneous ICDs. So those studies will give us additional information as well as a long-term follow-up of this study. We anxiously await the results of those studies. But this study showed us that this can be broadly used in the population, this device can be broadly used in the population.